Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Hardfire Media Liberal Conversations, a series of screen media programs we are doing to discuss current events and to help us get through this unique time of unprecedented state exercise of power in certain areas. The idea for the series comes from classical liberalism, which is based on free speech, freedom of religion, and equal rights under law. And also, we might add, a robust private sphere. These discussions are available on our Hardfire YouTube channel, where we have been producing content. Before, we had been producing content at the Bricks Art Media House in downtown Brooklyn, but the TV studio has been closed now for the last 18 months since the New York lockdown, even though the mayor of New York is announcing the opening of the city with 5 concerts in the 5 boroughs. It's not open because the studio is locked down, our local library is still locked down, and our local public gym is still locked down. Anyway, so now we've been making these programs independently. My name is Cameron Weber. I'm an economist and historian and the producer of Hardfire. We have had about 20 of these conversations since the national emergency of March 2020, and the current president, who said that they were going to undo everything the previous president did, extended these emergency powers on February 24th. We should note that we're more than 18 months into a lockdown, which is supposed to last 3 weeks while we all get herd immunity. The state never lets a good crisis go to waste. We are seeing some loosening of restrictions, but it remains to be seen to what extent we will recover our freedoms of movement and association. For example, today we have with us Canadian economist Gary Marshall. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Cameron, for having me
on. For example, Gary's from Canada, and the Wall Street Journal recently had an article, a chart, a graph showing how even though the Delta variant is highly contagious, it's also not at all very deadly. So then the Foundation for Economic Education used this Wall Street Journal article to say that any additional closings or prolonged lockdown would be an abuse of power. And then shortly, a day or two after that, the current administration of the United States says we can no longer travel to Canada. And that's an indefinite statement. Did you know about that, Gary?
Oh, we've been inundated with a number of rules and regulations changing, shifting sand, you name it. It's just been an abomination.
It doesn't create a very good business environment, that's for sure, investment environment.
No, it isn't. And I think we're going to suffer the consequences of this for many years to come.
Exactly. Like it is, the interventions are as greater than those during the Great Depression. I agree, which is a big structural shift in the markets. So again, I've got with me Gary Marshall. Gary is a public finance, really a philosopher, right? I mean, a philosopher and also a meter reader, and a public finance researcher. And Gary writes for RealClearMarkets, which is a pretty prestigious gig. And we're going to be talking today about Gary's idea of funding government without taxes, or government without taxes. And Gary's website, economart.ca, economart.canada, Gary has a $10,000 challenge if someone can find a fatal flaw in this argument that he's about to put forth. And I'll say that I've looked at it, and with the assumptions that Gary has made, there's no flaw. The only thing I would say is that it might require a lot of coercion to make happen, but we'll talk about that. So the first thing, so Gary, thank you. Welcome to the show. Anything you want to say
Thank you.
before we start?
Yes, I appeared on this program 13 years ago, so we've come back for a bit of an update, and I'll let you know. So as many are not aware, I've been studying a very unusual idea in public finance now for about 25 years. There is, I believe, a very bad premise operating in public finance that we all know but fail to recognize. It's imagined that government funds government, or a good portion of public expenditures via taxation revenues. I contend that this is wrong, that government does not fund government, has no revenues, and that it is fully dependent upon others for the means to pay for public goods and services. The government can never escape a deficit because every dime it spends is deficit financed. Now, if I'm right about what I've discovered, economics shall change broadly and profoundly. And if I'm wrong, then we continue on the road to ruin. So that's the idea. Do we have a bad premise in public finance? And I am certain we do.
Right. So Gary's going to explain his idea, and especially the idea related to the idea is to eliminate the coercion and inefficiency of tax and spend through strictly debt financing of the state. And you're talking about the central state, right? The people with the power to print money and the central bank.
Yes, well, it's kind of you've got the politicians that love to spend other people's money, and then you've got now the means by which they would take the money was taxation, but now you've got taxation in conjunction with borrowing. And of course, any limits that taxation is a very painful thing, and it consists of fines and penalties placed upon the productive class.
And in the end, it's always enforced by the point of a gun, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the slippery slope of state intervention, right?
You have no choice but to pay your taxes. But now that they've come along and added borrowing into the mix of taxation and borrowing, government is spending wildly. There's no controls anymore. Taxation used to control it, but that is gone. There's
with
such thing.
Standard. Yeah, because they don't have to exchange paper for gold and gold for paper, so central banks can print money ad infinitum and buy government debt. But why don't you present so Gary's going to spend a few minutes presenting his idea, and then we're going to talk about Gary's idea, and especially as it applies to the United States, some of the injustices and inequalities and inequities caused by our current public finance scheme. So take it away, Gary.
So we're at a fork in the road, and the question of what funds government must be settled before we go any further. Is a major premise in public finance theory wrong? Does government fund government? If yes, then all the clamor over the threat posed by public debt, federally in the US now at 28 trillion, is justified, and we continue along the wretched and ruinous path of endless government tyranny. If no, if government does not fund government, then we quickly arrive at one inescapable conclusion: the abolition of taxation and the end of government tyranny. Now, I've never had it argued that government funds government. I've never seen said argument that the funds that government raises by confiscating or taxing people, one concludes as being government money. And I think it's a self-evident truth that government does not fund government. Otherwise, any thief is bizarrely self-sufficient.
Yeah.
So
Gordon Tullock, the Economist, did a lot of work on that. Gordon Tullock, but sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
Oh, no, that's fine. So if we apply this information that government doesn't fund government, then all conventional analysis on public debt can be swept aside. So if it is agreed, I'll just step ahead here and say, if it is agreed that government does not fund government, that it has no funds or resources, that every dime it spends is deficit financed, then really what funds government? Simply, the answer is simply that taxpayers, or rather resident citizens, specifically their assets, incomes, and property. That's what funds government. And if one places these items in an imaginary box and calls this collective that which funds government, then one must focus on this box in order to answer or in order to extract truths about the nature and condition of public finances. Now, does it matter to the imaginary box of assets whether government borrows or taxes from it in order to fund public expenditures? I conclude that it makes no difference, that there is a superficial equivalence between taxation and borrowing, and that is taxation and borrowing from the imaginary box, that which funds government. And I say superficial because taxation and borrowing are not the same thing. There are massive costs in taxation, as we are well aware, government waste, but also the deterrent effect of taxation. Taxation is simply just fines and penalties placed upon productive activities. And that deterrent effect greatly limits your economic activity. Now, these costs, government waste and deterrence, disappear with borrowing. Thus, it is always better that a government borrow from rather than tax the box of assets to fund public expenditures. So that is the essential idea. Does government fund government? I don't believe it does. Doesn't fund any of it. And it's the assets, property, and incomes of resident citizens that fund government.
Right.
Now, is it better that we borrow or tax from that box? And I say it's better that we borrow from it rather than tax.
Yeah, and you've been working on this idea for 25 years, so you've
Long
found it
time.
inside and out. And all right, so thank you for the introduction. So we should note that Gary's plan has a lot of assumptions to it and a lot of good ideas. In preparing for the show, I asked Gary to simplify his ideas for a general audience. So now we're going to discuss his main points one at a time, right, Gary? Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So the points in order. Do you want to read the points, or do you want me to read the points?
Well, it's just, does government fund government? I think the answer is clearly no.
Right.
Now, some people may argue that government by tax revenues funds itself for a good portion of what it spends. And I argue this is wrong, because taking from people is not earning. It's not like they're an entity going out there and earning their keep in the marketplace, or providing some product or service like any private business and deriving revenues from that. They're just taking.
In our last show we did, a frequent guest on our program, John Clifton, said also in passing that we could eliminate taxes but put in user fees, right? If government's actually providing a service, put in user fees. But your first point, to recap my argument in simple terms, the government does not fund government, that it has no money, or rather resources, that every dime it spends is definite finance. Okay, so my response was, okay, the state is a parasite. This I get. Max Weber, the eminent sociologist, he said that the state has a legal monopoly on coercion over a certain region. Public choice economists call this the stationary bandit, and that's what you've been discussing. And anthropologists describe how the state derives from territorial conquest. So we agree that the government is, to use harsh words, a parasite, because it has to take from those who are productive, right? Like any parasite.
Correct, yes. Yes. And that is now, in an economic sense, when you say that, you just say that they rely upon the income and wealth of others in order to do to provide their goods.
All right.
That's government.
Now then, the second point you made, and here we're going to talk about some interesting things, that it makes no difference to the collective of assets held by the residents of a jurisdiction, whoever has the monopoly and coercion over a geographic area, jurisdiction, whether government taxes or borrows from it. So here, the main assumption and where it deviates from the United States is that this assumes, Gary, that all borrowing, all spending comes from borrowing. That does not include central bank money printing. So
Correct, yes.
one of the things you need to close your system is to abolish the central bank monopoly, right?
Well, you can keep a central bank for the purposes of a clearinghouse. So they operate as a clearinghouse between the different banks, but they are prohibited from owning any federal government bonds, treasuries, municipal bonds, state bonds. And same with any corporation.
Yeah.
The only people that would be able to own bonds are the people, the public, and resident citizens, and pension funds, which are just the pooled earnings of resident citizens.
Right. So the reason I mentioned that, thank you. The reason I mentioned that because in the United States during the crisis period, so the intent there, the necessary condition is that the state has a good enough credit rating that they can go out to the private markets and borrow. Right. So that then puts incentives for the state not to spend more than they have in revenues, and the revenues would be purely based on the credit rating. And so what I wanted to say about the United States is the way that in mainstream Keynesian economics and what's been done historically, after the housing boom and bust, and then after the COVID state lockdowns, during certain periods, the central banks, the US central bank was buying more bonds than was the market. So in other words, they would just print money and buy the bonds. And this printing money, by definition, causes inflation because there's more money chasing goods. And inflation is regressive. And we'll cover that in a bit. So the stimulus idea of using the central bank would violate your point that it would have to be privately and individually held debt and pension funds.
Correct.
All right. So
the reason I say that is because that way the public have full control over public expenditures. There's no way that private banks, central banks can go in and buy up this debt. That means that the resident citizens have full control over all public expenditures.
And therefore they have more incentive to get information about exactly what the government is spending on. I think it's
exactly. The government will have to justify every penny it spends.
All right. The big thing I wanted to bring up in this point here is that, again agreeing with Gary that the central bank should not be buying government debt, or any type of debt, is that printing money is an invisible tax on the poor, and it helps the wealthy. The New York Fed in 2021, New York Fed even had a report that said that we should not do any more stimulus because that will just, number one, allow the stock markets and housing markets and art markets to go up. That's called the Cantillon effect. So when you have money channeling into stock markets and housing markets, and only the more wealthy can afford stocks and housing, stock market and housing investment. The poor, those with less disposable income, cannot. Yet, because of that easy money, they have to pay more for the means of life, for goods and services. So the stimulus that we've all lived with for 10 years after the housing boom, and then continued on over the last two years under COVID, is regressive. It hurts the poor and helps the rich. So
it lowers borrowing costs. Most, I mean, your private enterprise, your businesses, and your individuals involved in that, they benefit from a lower interest rate, which is what all this government, or what all the central bank.
But the idea is supposed to be that the money goes into investment, but like the New York Fed said, in reality, a good percentage of it goes into the stock market and the housing market. I mean, the housing markets have more of a bubble now than they did during the housing bubble.
Yes. Yes, it's getting worse too.
So what I want, yeah, right, it is. And so one a critique I wanted to make, you can't really talk of a collective because different interventions affect different people individually. So, but you had this idea of this ideology of a collective that would get behind this idea of uh, funding government by debt only. What do you mean by collective, I guess is my question.
Well, I was just a collective of assets. When you think of what funds government, when you look out into the land and you say that it's the private economy that funds government, specifically, businesses which are just owned by individuals. So you have this collective of assets. It's an imaginary boss. That's what essentially.
Oh, got it. The imaginary boss. We did a show a few months ago about Henry George's land tax, single tax on land. Have you heard about that? Well, you're against that because you're against any kind of tax, or haven't.
Well, I know tax. I mean, it's there, it's present. But no, I hadn't heard of a single. You mean like just a flat tax?
Just the tax on unfinished portions of land, and that's.
Oh yes, okay.
The details of working that out would be very, very difficult, and who decides that. Okay. So there is a solution. Gary's solution of getting rid of this, keeping a central bank as a clearinghouse, very good, but preventing the central bank from printing money and buying debt. That's a very.
Well, they can buy debt. Their central function was to stabilize a banking system in a crisis. So if they have a bank that's in need of funds, they're free to lend to the bank. Okay. They just cannot take collateral in the form of treasuries or hold treasuries.
Very
They're
good.
just restricted to dealing with banks on their terms. And private banks cannot buy the debt either. Right. Because with the fractional reserve banking, they can grossly inflate the amount of money they can lend to government. So they're restricted.
That's a whole nother conversation about how do you.
That is.
So Hayek had one of the last things he was working on, Frederick Hayek, was one way to keep the central bank honest is to allow competition in currency, because then you're not going to be deflating the value of your dollar, Canadian dollar, US dollar. Canada doesn't have the problem the US has, right? You don't have the welfare warfare state like we do.
Oh, we do. Believe me, it's a pretty bad one. It's just, you don't see it, but it's there. And it favors certain political groups over others.
Exactly. So, for example, the Treasury Department and the central bank don't like competition against their currency because it helps the wealthy who donate to campaigns in the revolving door between the state and the private sector. So one of the, right when Bitcoin was first coming out and getting popular, they declared it an asset, meaning that if the value of your alt currency goes up, your Bitcoin goes up, you have to pay a capital gains tax on it, right?
Yes.
You don't have to pay a capital gains tax if the dollar appreciates, of course, which it doesn't do, especially now because we're printing so much dollars.
Correct, yes. Well.
Okay, so number 3, and here's a good one. I wanted to say in the introduction, our topic will be government without taxes. And of course, nobody likes taxes unless somebody else is paying them.
Correct, yes. So now there won't be any battle over taxes. Nobody pays taxes. You just have the government goes out with a spending bill that it has to fund. It goes out to the financial markets. It borrows from the resident citizens of that jurisdiction.
Tax compliance is larger than the net resources that go into tax compliance in the United States are larger than the automobile industry.
Yes, and it's this would save a huge amount of money in tax collection. I mean, I don't know how large the U.S. Code books now are for the taxation, but I think they used to be one book. They're probably about 8 or 9 volumes now, but and a very complicated mess that not even the people at the IRS understand.
And the current administration, believe me, Team Red and Team Blue are equally onerous to me, but the current administration wants to double the people in the IRS.
Yes, yeah, it's
Or
a reward for failure, I guess.
okay.
Government.
So your third point, there are huge, here we go. There are huge costs in taxation, deterrence, and government waste. There's a huge, thank you. You just got 3 minutes left.
Ooh,
There's huge costs in taxation, deterrence, and government waste that disappear with borrowing from the local collective assets that shall greatly enhance the wealth of collective. So can you just give us example of some of these government waste and how your program would address the waste of taxation and government waste and spending and special interest spending?
well, you have a massive system now of government spending that caters to people who don't work. You have a welfare system that rewards people for not working. Able-bodied people able to get out there and work, and they're paid not to work.
And
So
that,
you've got a massive welfare system.
yeah. Well, in the 30s, there was my history PhD focused on the 1930s when you had the CCC, the whatever, Civilian Conservation Corps, which the idea was to create citizen soldiers, right? To have to be on a war footing. And same thing, the original welfare was created, aid to family with dependent children, in order that mothers would stay home and raise citizen soldiers. And this is all documented in the 1930s literature. But anyway, we should wrap it up. As our director said, we just have 3 minutes left. Gary, thank you for presenting and debating your ideas about a government without taxes. One of your assumptions is that the state and politicians want to see economic growth. But I live in New York, where our current mayor has declared that the purpose of his government is to redistribute, not create economic growth, which reduces absolute poverty. How would you respond to this? You seem to assume that we want to have economic growth, which reduces poverty, absolute poverty. But is that really what politicians want?
Well, politicians want to spend other people's money. That's their whole purpose for being. And redistribution is the way they go about it. And under a system of borrowing, they would have to approach people, the resident citizens of that community, to borrow the funds in order to go about and do the work of government.
And it would reduce taxing and it would reduce spending because you'd have to keep your risk rating clean. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, who's going to stand for corruption in government? I mean, if you control the funds that go to government, you're not going to give them a dime. That's like sitting across from your banker every day, every hour of every day.
Exactly. Voting every day. Exactly. I'll tell you what, we're going to do another show and talk about how and when and why the US dollar was downgraded and why then it was not downgraded, dollar denominated debt. So we'll work on that one. So anyway, I'd like to thank Gary Marshall for coming on our show about government without taxes, ? And thank you for watching Hardfire Media Liberal Conversations. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Cameron.
Essential, essential, essential.